So now that we understand the basics of algorithmic composition, I want to look at how we actually do this in EarSketch. So we're going to look at this in a kind of broad way in this video, and we'll delve into some of the API functions in a much more detail in the coming videos. And towards the end of the module, we'll talk about some general strategies for algorithmic composition and implement them in EarSketch. So what we'll talk about in this video again is the main functions in the EarSketch API that we use for algorithmic composition, some important Python constructs that will help us to write algorithms in Python for making music, and we'll look at an example of doing this. So first, let's talk about algorithmic composition in EarSketch. There's some key API functions that we'll use for doing three different things. The first one is the equivalent to taking an audio file and importing it onto your DAW multitrack timeline. So we can essentially take any audio file we want and place it on any track and at any time that we might want to do. The second thing is the equivalent to the pattern sequencing technique that we looked at in the very last video of Module 3 when we were talking about that pattern sequencer with that grid that you could click on. So this allows us to create rhythms that trigger sound files similar to a sampler at different moments in time on a timing grid. And then the third thing is we'll look at ways to set effects, to add them to tracks, to set their parameters, and to create envelopes to automate changes in those parameters. So now I want to look at a whole script that shows you kind of what you can do with EarSketch and the EarSketch API functions. So we're going to go through this rather quickly. We'll go into the details of how everything works in the next few videos. But I just want to walk through this quickly line by line. So we have a comment at the beginning saying that we're setting up some basics of EarSketch. We have our API import statement, so we're bringing in all the EarSketch functionality. And then in it is creating a new project, and then we're setting our tempo to 120 BPM. In this next section here, we're defining a whole bunch of variables, and each one of these variables represents a particular sound from the EarSketch sound library. So you can see how all those have been defined. And then down here, this last thing that we're defining, again, we'll look at this in more detail later, but this is a beat string, where each of these zeros is corresponding to a 16th note of music. And we're explaining where we want notes to play and where we want notes, the music to be silent as we're building up a rhythm. Next, we start calling a bunch of these fit media functions, which place particular sounds on particular tracks at particular starting and ending measures. And we've seen fit media a little bit already, and we'll look at it in more detail in the next video. And so there's a bunch of these for different sections of music on different tracks, kind of layering sounds together and building up our piece. And then you'll see sprinkled in here, there's also a few of another kind of function, this make beat function, which is taking a sound, putting it on a track at a particular measure, but using one of those beat strings that had the zeros and the dashes to create a new kind of rhythm out of that sound. And then the only other thing that's really in this script is calls the set effect function. And so you can see all these set effect calls are setting the volume on different tracks to particular values. And those numbers are in decibels. So it's basically just controlling the balance of our mix, which tracks are a little louder, which ones are a little softer, so everything will sound a little bit better together. And then on one track, on track 6 here, we've added a distortion effect with a little bit of distortion as well. And then we call finish to finish this all up and get it ready for playing. Again, we'll go through all the details of how these API functions work, subsequent videos, but I wanted to show you a kind of complete example to show you that you can really make an interesting piece of music out of all of this. So I'll go ahead and hit the Run Script button. Our script is run. I'll switch to the Workstation tab, and we can listen to what this sounds like. Let me zoom this out a little bit so that we can see more tracks on our screen. I can't fit them all on the screen because there's a lot of tracks here, but you get the picture. I can also hide our effects lanes here. That'll help me see a few more tracks. So in addition to those EarSketch API functions that enable us to put effects onto onto various tracks and set their parameters, to place audio on different tracks and locations, and to create rhythms with a pattern sequencing paradigm, we're also going to learn about some important Python computing constructs that help us to create algorithms. We'll revisit loops, which I know we looked at in Module 4, but we'll look at how we can use them in the context of algorithmic composition. We'll also look at lists, ways to organize lists of numbers or constants or variables or anything like that, and work with them, in particular how we can combine using loops and lists together. And we'll also look at how to generate random numbers in Python and various strategies for doing that and their implications. So what we've covered in this, this video here are these three basic EarSketch API functions for working with the DAW and placing and editing audio and effects. And then we've also looked at these core Python constructs that we'll be using. We're going to go right ahead and in the next video delve into that fit media function in much more detail. That'll show us all the different ways that we can place audio files on the multi-track timeline in EarSketch.